We're back for another session in the Introduction to the Novel course. And tonight we're going to discuss a major writer, Herman Melville, whose book, Redburn, is not the first book that he's written, but by many considered one of the best. He thought it was a failure, but over the years the book has produced such profound thought and introduced so many autobiographical details that it not only gives us insight into Melville himself, but it gives us insight into his thought, his reading, the art he viewed, and some of the experiences in terms of abolition and the attitude toward politics in the 19th century that affected Herman Melville. Melville was born in 1819 in New York City and attended the male high school there in 1825. It's very interesting that he used to take out books in the public library, and some years ago Merton Seltz did a study of all the books that Melville took out of the New York Public Library by checking his library cards, saying his signature on them. So we have a very good record, not only of what Melville read as he was growing up, but we have a very good record of what he was thinking in the books as he begins exposing us to the literature he himself has read. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time tonight talking about the kinds of books he read by virtue of studying what Redburn himself has said about these books. In 1830, there was a serious problem in the family. His father, who had an importing business, failed. He went bankrupt. And Melville and his family left New York City for Albany, New York, where he enrolled in the Albany Academy. In 1832, he really had to withdraw from school. His father dies in that year, leaving the family heavily in debt. He decided at some point that he ought to go to sea. At least this was one way out for a youngster who had no hope for a college education and had no way of making a living. So on June 5th, 1839, he sailed on the St. Lawrence, a packet boat traveling to Liverpool, England. And he returned in October, about 4 months, which was the length of the trip that Redburn sailed when he first sailed to Liverpool. When he returned October 1st, Melville began to teach school in New York, in Greenbush, New York. But in 2 years, he sailed as a seaman on a whaler, the Acushnet, A-C-U-H-N-E-T, which left Massachusetts and headed for the South Seas. Now, a whaler is generally a long 2-year voyage, sometimes longer. And Melville in 1842 deserted the ship in the Marquesas Islands. He actually there became familiar with the Indian Typees, T-Y-P-E-E-S, lived among the cannibals, and wrote a book called Typee, which we'll talk about in a few moments. He also took a mistress among the natives, and this doesn't seem to be anything usual among the sailors. Of course, in Redburn, we learn about Max, who has 2 wives, one in the States and one overseas, whom he spends time with, and presumably who know nothing about each other. What else do we know about Melville? A lot is told by the circumstances of his novels. And I want to mention a few of these novels to you because they're really important in the mainstream of his art. In fact, Melville has written few enough books that you can read them all in a semester, but of sufficient length and of sufficient depth that they'll take you several years more analyzing them and proceeding to study them more closely. His first book, Typee, was published in 1847 at a time when his wife was giving birth to the first child. Typee was an instant sensation. People wanted to study and read about a man who lived among the cannibals. He was in an exotic world, and he explains, somewhat like Defoe in Crusoe, how these fires that they found may have contained the remnants of human bones. People were fascinated by Melville's study of the South Seas. He followed that in 1847 by a book called Omu, which is really a satire on the efforts of the missionaries to convert the native islanders. And then in 1848 he wrote a book which is really very iconoclastic called Mardi. In Mardi, the hero Taji, looking for religion, makes an arduous journey up a mountaintop to find there the sage who can tell him the secret of the world. And when he gets up to the top and peers into the hut where the sage sits and asks the question of what are the truths and the wonders of the world, the only answer he gets is nothing, as he sees the sage sitting in darkness. And his descent from that hill is very rapid, because having now found himself discouraged, disappointed, and disillusioned with this religious insight, we find Melville more and more moving into an iconoclastic point of view. He wrote Redburn in 1849. Redburn in 1849 becomes his autobiographical story. And we'll talk about Redburn the rest of the day, but mention a few other books that are important in his work. White Jacket in 1850 deals with the same character, Redburn, who is on a military ship. And in 1851, Melville produces Moby Dick. You would think that the man who produced Typee would have reached the apogee of his career, the high point of his career, when he produces Moby Dick. But in fact, most people didn't understand Moby Dick. It was a philosophical triumph and a reader's misery. But I submit to you that if you're going to read Moby Dick in today's world, when we attempt to understand what life is about, you can almost eliminate the chase for the white whale that Ahab conducts and read the philosophical chapters. Chapters called The Lifeline, The Squeeze, in which Melville, in his most eloquent way, tries to understand the bond between human beings, the nature of life, and the speed with which the miracle of life can be snuffed out in any moment, although in one of these chapters it has to do with a man being caught in the coils of a rope as it's being played out and as the harpoon is whipping out toward the whale. A man caught in the rope, forced overboard, drowned in this accidental life that we can't explain, but whose properties we must enjoin. We must be part of the life scheme, even though we can't explain how things are going to happen or when they're going to happen. The chase for the white whale, of course, is the chase for, or is a book that deals with Ahab's obsession. The white whale, we're not sure what it resembles, what it means. The whale, I think we profit best if we don't look upon it as being something evil. We profit best if we don't look at it as being some object that can be easily identified. Like that mystical beast with many hands beneath the ocean, the kraken that Redburn that Melville mentions in this book and that Tennyson mentions in his poem, The Kraken. It is some beast that resembles life and that by itself is a miracle of existence that man ought not chase down if it's not necessary or not necessarily part of his own being, and certainly ought not be part of his own vengeance. Melville followed Moby Dick with a Gothic novel, Pierre, in 1852, which deals with themes of miscegenation at a time when, of course, the entire United States was fraught over the question of slavery. Redburn was written in 1845. Was written in 1849, 4 years before Texas had become a state, and then in quick succession, Iowa, I think the same year, Wisconsin, New Mexico, California. So the United States was growing. In fact, as a result of the victory over Mexico, one estimate has it that the United States expanded its area by 500,000 square miles. So these are interesting times. One of the problems that came up politically in these times, of course, is what happened when Nebraska and Kansas became states. At the time, the southern states were fairly well identified as being slave states. The northern states were generally identified as being abolitionist states, free states. And I guess a choice, some historians say a choice should have been made when Kansas and Nebraska came into the Union, whether they should have been slave or free. But in fact, the choice was left up to the citizens in the territories. And that led to political infighting. It led to abolitionist movements. It led to the tempestuous events ultimately culminating in the Civil War. So that Melville is aware of these events. Melville's aware of the slave trade, as he mentions at least half a dozen times in Redburn, what slaves are like, what happens to them. He's even surprised to find out how slaves are treated freely in London. And if you remember at one point in Redburn, he makes the claim that it takes foreigners to teach us the real truths of the Declaration of Independence. And we'll talk about that as we move along. One of his later books, Israel Potter, is a story of a man, an Englishman, who wanders for 40 years outside of England. And finally returning to England, wandering outside of America and finding himself, Israel Potter is wandering 40 years outside of the environs of America, finds himself in the garden talking with George III. and it becomes a rather interesting conversation. Melville is also known for his short stories. He writes some amazing short stories. I think some of the best short stories you'll find in the language. One of them, The Lightning Rod Man, has a narrator who is confronted by a man selling lightning rods and warning him that if he doesn't buy these lightning rods, he may be struck down dead. And the narrator, the homeowner, doesn't want himself to be threatened by this salesman who says, you either take what I want or you're going to die, because it seemed to him very much like the religious orthodoxy, the Calvinists telling him, you had better believe what we believe or else you shall go to eternal damnation. The Lightning Rod Man is one of the fine iconoclastic stories that you'll ever read. Benito Cereno, a story of a ship taken over by the slaves who are supposed to be prisoners. And we don't learn until the end of the novel, with a surprising ending when the mate's body is unveiled as the figurehead of the boat, that the slaves who we thought were under the command of the Spanish captain Benito Cereno actually are in command of the ship. You've read in your classes Bartleby the Scrivener. You haven't read Eye in My Chimney, in which a man feels that he is being accosted by his wife and her lawyer who are looking for his treasure. And he prefers to be near his furnace with all the ducts leading from the furnace throughout the house. And they're sure that somewhere in that furnace or somewhere that man's treasures may be found. And those who view that story philosophically realize that the furnace and the ducts leading from the furnace are the mind of man. And the treasure lies in one's knowledge and one's wisdom. Melville has also written 5 books of poetry. And I had meant to bring in the poems, several poems today to read, but I didn't do it, unfortunately. You can look up his poetry. Among the poems, The Maldive Shark describes the ineffable nature of creation beneath the waves, the mysteries of the ocean and the mysteries of life that man cannot fathom. He also has a poem in which he discusses the abolition movement, one called John Brown's Body. The poem is written in such a way that you almost get the impression, as the lines move in a wavy fashion, of John Brown hanging, the poem being a graphemic representation of the consequences of John Brown's attempt to raise arms against slavery. And then you have another poem by Melville in which he describes the sad fate of blacks hanged on Wall Street by the New York Irish who didn't want to be drafted during the Civil War because they didn't feel it was worthwhile to go to war to save the black slaves and to see them find their freedom. Melville's part of the politics of the 19th century. He's part of the politics of the abolition movement. He's part of the politics of iconoclasm, in which he finds sufficient hypocrisy in the world to deny freedom, liberty, conscience, personal expression, viability, the viability of human life. And we'll see all these problems when we get to Redburn. There are a number of events occurring during Melville's lifetime that are important. But one of the experiences he had was his trip to the Holy Land. He went to Palestine and wrote perhaps the longest poem in the American language called Clerel, C-L-A-R-E-L. Clerel is the story of a divinity student who goes to Palestine and falls in love with the Jewish daughter of a convert to Judaism. Ruth's father, however, is slain by an Arab. And when Clerel arrives in the Holy Land, he discovers that there's going to be a period of mourning which he cannot participate in. And so he leaves to take a trip around the Holy Land in this poem Clerel, in which he tries to find out the nature of religion and the source of religion. But he's sorely disillusioned. He goes to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem to find out that the various sects, religious sects, are fighting over who is in charge of which stations of the cross. He leaves there and goes into the desert looking for monks living in the Judean mountains, hoping to find the religious spirit and the religious hope. Instead, he finds Orthodox monks so impoverished, living in such hard circumstances that most of their time is spent eking out a living and even searching for water, keeping their stores, so that they have very, very little time for religious expression or spiritual enlightenment. That's at a monastery which still exists in Palestine today, in Israel, called Marsabah. It's characterized by the fact that the monks have a skull room. All the monks who have ever worked and lived in Marsabah have their skulls incarcerated in a room on shelves. Now, I never got there. I was trying to track Melville's trips the last time I was in Israel, and the problem was that there were women in our group too, and women weren't allowed in the monastery, so we never got to Marsabah. Clerel returns to Jerusalem on Easter Day and carries the cross on his own shoulders up the Via Dolorosa to the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, with great anticipation of seeing his beloved after the month is over, only to discover that she has died of heartbreak. So Melville's impression of the Holy Land is one of strife, dissension, aridness, and disillusionment. This was toward the end of his life. He published the poem, I believe, in 1881. I don't have too much to say about Melville as a religionist at this point. There are a large number of books written about Melville, Melville's quarrel with God, and books of that style. But after his death, several books were published, including Billy Budd. Billy Budd is often given a Christological interpretation. But I have some feeling that this is misreading Melville, because toward the end of his life he was relatively disillusioned. Just a few more details and we're going to move into Redburn, which is the book we're supposed to be discussing. And I don't know how much we're going to get done tonight. I just keep thinking that there's a lot more to do with this book than you'd ever imagine. Of course, with all these books, there's more than you could ever imagine. What I hope is going to happen tonight is that some of you will find this book so intriguing, and parts of it so intriguing, that you'll begin to explore it more deeply the way I think you should. And then you can write a research paper. Your Your research paper, we've mentioned before, or I haven't mentioned it all, I guess, but I should say something about it. You have free reign. You've conducted a data search. You know what kinds of materials you're looking for. But the first thing you should do is come up with some idea. What is it that you intimately want to say about this book or this work? Then sit down and go through the book the way I've been going through these books these last few weeks and pick out as much information as you can that will enhance and enrich your argument. And write 5 or 6 pages in which you assert the point of view you think is important to assert. If you think Melville is religious, say so. If you think he is anti-religious, say so. If you think he is compassionate, say so. If you think he's ironic, say so. And then after that, go to some of the articles you've researched in your database search and see what the critics are saying. Because they can enrich your argument, they can enhance it, they can move it into a new dimension. I think when you're beginning a research paper, you should at least look at 4 different pieces of information. You should look at a biography about the author. You should look at the author's correspondence, if it's available, to see what he himself is saying outside of the novels. And since we have the Gentleman's Magazine in our library, which is an English newspaper, you could check that if you're dealing with English authors, or if you want to see what Melville may have been saying in 1849. This book was written in 1849. Melville, I believe, was in England in Liverpool. What year did I say that was? 1839. So 10 years. So between 1839 and 1849, go to the Gentleman's Magazine and see if you can find anything about Liverpool, anything about the slave trade. Liverpool was a center of slave movement. See if there's anything you can add or find that Melville might have put into the novel that gives you insight. So you have an original source in our library, the Gentleman's Magazine. You have the a biography, you have the correspondence, and then you have the articles that you have found in the database. When you begin to write, you can improve your writing 100% by eliminating as much as possible TH words at the beginning of a sentence. Instead of saying, there are 4 points I wish to emphasize, simply say, Melville focuses on 4 major issues. Instead of saying, it is necessary, in order to understand what Melville believes, we have first to look at his religious background. Begin by saying, Melville's upbringing in a Calvinistic atmosphere may have somewhat been mitigated by the disappointments his family found in their lifetime. Find some way of beginning sentences so that each sentence has heart to it. If you write a rapid paper thinking you're going to revise it, you're going to have difficulty revising it. What you want to do is write good sentences and good ideas the first time and develop them. I don't want to take more time at this point from our basic discussion on how to write a research paper. But find at least 4 major topics to proceed on, or 4 major divisions of the topic you want to deal with. Write each section separately, and then when you're through, go back and write the introduction to your paper, because the paper will take on a life of its own. Now let's spend a little bit of time looking at the life of the novel Redburn. The novel itself consists of a number of events that basically tell the story. There are several major characters in the story. One is Wellingborough Redburn, who has to leave home because his family is bankrupt. His father is bankrupt, and he has no other way of surviving. And he decides to go on a voyage on the Highlander. During that voyage, he meets, among other characters, one of the most evil men one could ever expect to meet, and that is the sailor Jackson. Not only does Jackson have a grip over the sailors, not only does he make judgments that command the will and command the respect, or at least the fear of the sailors, but he becomes the agent of their activity in Liverpool when he's in charge of the table and cuts the meat. He becomes the arbiter when the tobacco runs out on ship, and only he can divide it in such a way that the men will take what little tobacco they have left until it runs out. Only Jackson can take it easy when the others are working. They know he's the best sailor in the ship, but he can do whatever he needs to do as quickly as he needs to do it. And on that account, he does as little as he needs to do. Until, of course, the time when Jackson, dying, probably from tuberculosis, high up on the yard, swings out over the ocean and drops into the sea dead, with his blood spurting on the sails as he falls. But the essence of evil, innocent Wellingborough Redburn discovers on the Highlander, and this becomes one of the tense moments on the ship, even though for a great many pages Redburn isn't even on the ship. A major figure in the book is Captain Riga, a Russian captain who cheats Wellingborough out of his wages because he himself has to live well, who rules the ship with an iron fist, who rules it dogmatically and paternalistically, somewhat indifferently, but keeps that ship on course, sailing into Liverpool and sailing back. Sailing with goods to Liverpool and sailing back with 500 immigrants on the ship. And we'll talk about the nature of these immigrants on the ship in a few moments. There are a number of minor characters in Redburn that we're going to spend some time working on. We're going to spend time with. But one of them, of course, is Harry Bolton, whom Redburn meets in Liverpool, who seems to be living a tempestuous life, who seems to be on the edge of wealth or failure, who seems to have a great deal of money and then loses in London, and who then leads a tragic life of a sailor and not a gentleman, as he sails back to America, subject to the punishment and the ridicule of the sailors who realize that Harry Bolton belongs in a different group, in a different world, in a different society than the sailors who can withstand the hardships of sea. There is a real difference between Wellingborough, Redburn, and Bolton. And to the extent that Bolton cannot survive and Redburn can survive, we have one of the stark contrasts of characters in the story, and we begin to understand why Harry Bolton is part of the story. Wellingborough, Redburn survives. Jackson does not. Bolton does not. He survives this voyage, but we learn later on that he was on a whaler and died as he fell overboard and was presumably crushed between the carcass of the whale and the hull of the ship. Well, let's talk about a few more events and just go through the story piece by piece. Redburn, we know, applies to the Highlander for a job aboard ship. And he's met by this wonderfully affable Captain Riga, who makes him feel at home and feel part of the family. But once on board ship, Redburn realizes the difference between the one who recruits and the one who commands. Redburn has difficulty adjusting to the ship. And I want to speak at length about what I consider to be the longitudinal development of Redburn's character as he moves from childhood to maturity and from innocence to experience. We're going to talk about Redburn's development in just a few moments. Redburn spends a lot of time describing Jackson, and we'll focus on those chapters. Redburn, young and inexperienced, is forced to go up into the masthead. He's forced to go into the masts, and for the first time he realizes how precarious life may be at sea, high up, as he looks down on the deck of the ship. In storms we find dead men hanging in the rigging of the ships. And then in Liverpool we discover that Redburn has the chance to tour the city with a guidebook. But the guidebook, being his father's, is old, unreliable, and the changes that have been wrought in society, the changes that have been wrought in the geography, the changes that have been wrought in the cities, the guidebook hasn't kept up with. And what does that tell us? Among other things, that history is somewhat deceiving, because the experiences we confront daily aren't the ones that our fathers had, aren't the experiences that they enjoyed, and aren't experiences we can repeat. In fact, if you want to say that to some extent this book is the denial of history, it would be an interesting thesis. The ways in which this book does not, under circumstances, support the historical thought that we benefit from the past, learn from the past, and improve on the past. The past, to some extent, in this book doesn't teach us at all the experiences we're about to confront in life. The return from Liverpool is its own experience with the death of Jackson. And when Redburn returns to New York, he is wiser, less innocent, but no less honest and no less civilized than he was when he left. Redburn experiences and benefits from his experience, while many others are not survivors. And when we go back and start talking about various parts of this story, among other things, we're going to look at the nature of poverty in Liverpool and the way that, and we are going to admit ourselves to the discovery of people who are not survivors in this world. The woman in the cellar, some of the immigrants who can't survive the famine on ship, and of course people like Jackson and Harry Bolton who meet their doom. One perhaps deservedly so, and the other simply an innocent, one of those people in this world incapable of surviving no matter what efforts they make, either by their wit or by malfeasance, by generous action and friendship, or by criminal intrigue, such as we find with Harry Bolton. Harry is ambiguous, and we'll discover in a few moments what Harry Bolton is all about. But one of the things I'd like to mention is, first, that we have to learn a little bit about the language. And I'm going to put this up on the ship here. Put it up on the ship. I'm going to put this on the platform here, and if we can look at certain sea terms, we begin to learn what Redburn must learn. What does it mean to be coiling away the hawsers? What does it mean to sing out at a rope? By the way, the page numbers I have here, as usual, I did not check to see which book we're using. I've been using an earlier edition of this book, and mine is Redburn in 300 pages, and yours is Redburn how many pages? 406. So that yours is a reprinting of Redburn. I think yours is actually a printing of the pages in their early format, or their original edition. So unfortunately, the pages I have here are not going to conform to your book. But I can give you the chapters, but in the meantime, let's not even look at that. What does it mean to sing out at a rope? Well, when the sailors start pulling on the ropes, when they start tightening the knots, when they start lifting the sails, when they start reefing the sails or lowering them, there's a certain rhythm that they sing, and some of the sailors are adept at leading the men in this rhythmic action so that they're pulling together and tying together. To stun the sails is another term. We'll talk about that. I'll explain it. Redburn rediscovers that there are different terms. He realizes that there are no pegs on a boat, there are plugs. And he has to learn such terms as the starboard main top gallant blow line. He has to learn, among terms, what the larboard fore-topsail clew line is, what Samson's post is, what the jib boom is, what the capstan is, what it means to strike a top-gallant mast. Well, I'm going to try to draw a ship just to give you some idea what some of the ship's terms may be that we're going to be seeing. So if we can look on the pad here, I'll give you a crude example of a ship, and we'll try to see what happens. Of course, you have the ship itself, and the mast is actually two masts connected in that manner on these ships. And let's see if we can describe some of these sails. This sail, which comes out here and helps guide the ship, is called the flying jib. I'm not going to write it out, but this would be called the flying jib. And then you have another sail. Well, I'm going to put the flying jib here. Then your next sail would be the outer jib. And then you would have an inner jib, which comes about this point. And all of these sails, of course, become ways of helping you to maneuver the ship altogether. Then you have another sail here, which is called the Fore-Topmast Staysail. And at one point in the book, only the Fore-Topmast Staysail is out when the ship is trying to move into harbor. Now, what you have here is the foresail. This is the, let me make sure I've got it. Yeah. Now you've got this mast. Remember, those are ropes. Here you have the foresail on the foremast. You have a fore lower topsail, a fore upper topsail, and then where the second mast is fastened to the lower mast, where the higher mast is fastened to the lower mast, you have what we call the main topgallant staysail. Now this is the main topgallant sail. Above the main sail, okay, all right, I'm sorry, I'm confusing you right now. Here we have the mainsail, then we have the main lower topsail, then we have the main upper topsail. So you have your mainsail, your main lower topsail, your main upper topsail. 3 sails on the lower mast. The upper mast then is the main topgallant sail, and above that you have the main royal sail. Okay. The next mast I thought I would get this messed up, but let's see where we go at this point. Okay. Okay. This is the foresail. This is the mainsail. This is the main lower topsail. This is the main upper topsail. Then you have the main topgallant sail. Then you have the main royal. Now you move into the mizzen royal. So you have the mizzen royal staysail. Here you move up to the mizzen topgallant and the mizzen topmost. So you have your foremast, you have your mainmast, you have your mizzen mast. Each of these masts has a yard arm which holds the sails up and moves them out. Now, let's try one other ship. I'm going to show you the ship that presumably Redburn is sailing on, and this is called a brig. The brig itself, as opposed to a schooner with 3 masts, the brig in this case has 2 masts. So let me start with the masts, and they go like this. You have your foresail, on this mast. Then you have your fore lower topsail. You have your fore upper topsail. Then you have the next mast attached to that. And so you have the fore topgallant sail, the fore royal. This becomes the mainsail. This becomes the main lower topsail, the main upper topsail, and then the next mast goes up there. So you have the main topgallant sail and the main royal sail. This is known as the trysail. And then, again, on the front part of the boat, you have the flying jib and the outer jib. In this brig, you have a foresail and you have a mainsail. If you have the third mast, it then becomes the mizzen mast. And then, of course, under the ship, you have various decks depending on where you're going to be. So when we begin talking, or when you read in the book about Jackson falling from the yardarm off the mainsail, or they're moving up into the sail areas at the main topgallant sail, they're moving up to the next to highest sail, which is the royal. Okay. That may give you very little information, but you do need to have a little bit of information in order to see what's happening. Let me just check one detail here. Okay. This is a very complex business, these ships, and when you actually look at a sail and you see it in its configuration, you've got the yard arm. The mast is actually a set of winches where the ropes can be attached to parts of the sail. A sail, of course, is a piece of cloth woven together. And the sailors, when they reef the sail, have to be able to pull the sail up or lower it, depending on what needs to be done in order to either reduce the wind during a storm or to heighten the wind when you have very little and have to move along. Now, before we start analyzing what's happening in the book itself, I'd like to look at another series of items that we find in Redburn, and that is what Redburn teaches us, what Redburn's education has been. I'm going to go through the list of books that Redburn himself mentions in this particular book. And if you know what books we're talking about, you may want to comment about that. So let's look at this chart. And under education, what I want to mention to you is this. When you read Melville, the plot is only part of the story. You read Melville and the plot is ingenious, it's important, it's well structured, events lead into other events the way plots are supposed to lead. There are moments of tension and moments of relaxation. But when you start reading Melville, as far as I'm concerned, what's much more enticing are the philosophical chapters, are the attempts to analyze individual psychological differences between among people. What's interesting in Melville is how the mind of the narrator sees itself within the compass of all these other people who some of whom become part of his experience and most of whom become alienated from his experience. Well, Melville, Redburn says at the very beginning of the book, every man of them almost was of voyages and travels round the world. Now he's talking about the sailors. He says every sailor he met had a unique experience. Each one becomes a voyage, and as you sail with them, they tell you about their experiences in Malaysia. They tell you about their experiences in China. They tell you about their experiences in England. They tell you about their experiences in France, in Latin America, amongst the cannibals, so that each sailor becomes his own story. And we'll see how that works in certain areas. He mentions, among other characteristics, that he has read The Spectator. And he comments about The Spectator. Now, The Spectator was a rather important magazine in 1711 in England, 1710 and 1711 to 1713 in England. It was edited by Joseph Addison, who was a Secretary of State, and Richard Steele, who was a playwright and theater manager. And to realize that people in the 1840s are familiar with The Spectator is not surprising, because most of you read about The Spectator in your own work. It's generally covered in high school texts and certainly read in 18th century studies in the university. Now, I don't happen to have a copy of The Spectator here, but I do have a copy of the companion piece that came out before The Spectator. Addison and Steele first published a magazine called The Tatler. The Tatler was published Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. When they decided to publish The Spectator, they published it 6 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Now, there wasn't a press big enough to run a paper like that 6 days a week. So Addison had his own printer at work, and Steele had his own printer. And Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, when Addison's paper came out, version of The Spectator came out, Steele's printer was setting type for Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. 3,000 copies of this were printed. It was assumed that every copy was read by at least 4 people in the coffee houses. And this is what The Spectator looks like. Now, I'm supposed to be able to focus this, I think. Let's see if I can do it.
Dr. Rothman?
Yes.
Would you I know it's kind of considered a magazine, but did it have more than one page, or would you consider it like a newsletter or comparable to a newsletter?
No, it's one page. This is one page, and the essays are on one side of it, and then advertisements are on the other side. I guess we're not going to be able to. Oh yeah, here's one of the advertisements. Drinking glasses and decanters are being sold. There is some flint glass sold at some particular places. This is to give notice that 12 shillings per pound is the current price the shopkeepers of London and Westminster do sell this for. They're selling plate, they're selling candles. But the essays that you find in the Spectator papers, I think you can get there. Advertisement. Morning gowns for men and women of silk, stuffs, and calico. At any rate. This is one page that I have. I'd like to say it's worth $100,000. But the truth of the matter is, someone apparently tore up a lot of tattlers in order to sell them page by page. And so they're not as valuable as they might be if they were intact. So this is not the Spectator, but it is a contemporary magazine to the Spectator that I'm going to show you. All right. We find other books that Melville has read, or that Redburn has read. Can we go back to the pad? There we are. And let me get this back in focus. He comments frequently in this book on the Bible, Solomon's precepts. He mentions Moses, the man of Uz, Job, and Adam. And throughout Redburn, you have references to the Bible. If you're familiar with the Bible, then they become meaningful to you. We realize he has read Plutarch, and Plutarch reports that Brutus had ordered his son away to execution. He mentions having read Robinson Crusoe, an 18th century novel called Charlotte Temple, and he spends a lot of time on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Now let me mention The Wealth of Nations because it's one of the chapters he deals with is of the causes of improvement in the productive power of labor. Now, of course, the 18th and 19th century give us the Industrial Revolution. And during Melville's lifetime, we know that in 1831, Sir Michael Faraday discovered electromagnetic induction. We know that there was a patent process for converting pig iron to steel in 1855, developed by a man by the name of Sir Henry Bessemer. The Bessemer furnace was being developed. I think in 1844, the telegraph was available. So that throughout Melville's lifetime, you had, of course, the steam engine, the steamboat in 1820 already was on the ocean. It was on the Mississippi River. We have inventions in electromagnetics. We have a typewriter that was invented during this time, which was rather slower than handwriting. We have some advances in the sewing machine. The sewing machine was invented during Melville's lifetime. I don't have the date in front of me. I think it was around 1845 or 1846. And the spinning jenny, the power loom, became important during Melville's lifetime. Now, Smith's Wealth of Nations that Wellingborough Redburn mentions was written in 1776 by Adam Smith. And let me just read you quickly what is said about this particular book. If you look, we're on chapter 18 in your book. And Redburn says this. Saying this, he handed it to me, and I blew the dust off and looked at the back. Smith's Wealth of Nations. I glanced at the title page and found it was an inquiry into nature and causes. And it dealt with the alleged wealth of nations. Lying in my bunk, I began the book methodically at page number 1, resolved not to permit a few flying glimpses into it. And he begins to study the first chapter entitled The Causes of Improvement in the Productive Power of Labor. Dry as crackers and cheese, to be sure, he says, and the chapter itself was not much better. But this was only getting initiated. And if I read on, the grand secret would be open to me, the grand secret of life and economics. Drier and drier. The very leaves smelt of sawdust, till at last I drank some water and went at it again. But soon I had to give it up for lost work. Well, he falls asleep with a book in his hand. But you can be sure Melville didn't fall asleep with a book in his hand, even though Redburn's less willing to read it. The Wealth of Nations, as you're well aware, deals with the classic differences between labor, landlords, and capitalists, between those who receive wages, those who receive rent, and those who receive interest. When you take your GRE exam, Smith's Wealth of Nations and the equation of wages, profits, and interest are always somehow found, at least in one question, for some reason. If you've read Plutarch, if you've read The Wealth of Nations, if you've read Addison's A Spectator, then you understand that what you're getting by reading Redburn is an understanding of the classical education and the modern education that people in the 19th century were getting. You find out among the other books I read, the letters of Julius. In the first 10 years of the reign of George III, there was a bitter attack on the corruption of government in a series of letters appearing under the title Julius. No one knew who Julius was, but he apparently was someone close to the government because he knew a lot of information. And any price would be placed on the head of, the government sought to know who Julius was, and no one has yet, even today, identified who Julius was. But the attack on the government and the attack on government policies was unrelenting in those years that Julius was publishing. Redburn knows about Julius. He's read about Julius. He's also read about the 18th century character Ossian, who was an ancient bard. Macpherson, the 18th century poet, said he had found the papers of this ancient bard who sang of the past and gave us harmonies for the present. Many people think that Macpherson wrote Ossian's poems himself. When he was asked to produce the manuscripts that he had found, Macpherson was never able to produce them. But Ossian becomes a major romantic metaphor for new music, for new sounds, for new rhetoric, for a natural spirit based on the premise that the early shop or bard had the divine spirit in him. And then we discover that there are a plethora of guidebooks that have been read. And if you turn to chapter 30, you get some idea of all the different types of guidebooks. And of course, it's the guidebook in Liverpool that deceives Redburn, that leads him from place to place thinking that the buildings his father saw and the buildings his father had written about, commented about, eaten in, are gone because society encroaches on the past and rewrites history anew all the time. What are some of these guidebooks? One of them entitled A Voyage descriptif et philosophique de l'ancien et du nouveau Paris, miroir fidèle. A descriptive voyage in philosophy of old and new Paris. Another one, an instructive itinerary of Rome. On the next page, you have A Conductor Through Holland, A Picture of London. Another guidebook has the great roads, both direct and cross throughout England and Wales, from actual admeasurement by order of His Majesty's, so on and so forth. A green pamphlet with a motto from Virgil, entitled A Description of York, its antiquities and public buildings, particularly the cathedral. The guidebooks. That is, there's a whole world to be written of guidebooks even today. Some of you can make a living writing guidebooks. But the real issue is, what are the guidebooks that Redburn has encountered? Because these are guidebooks that just tell you how to move from one place to another and one street to another. But all the books that you read about in Melville are guidebooks into life. And I'll show you a few more. Livy, the historian, he has also read guidebooks that deal with classical mythology, the works of Greek grammarians, the works of Petronius, Seneca, Lord Byron. The book of Job becomes a guidebook. That is, the guidebooks themselves are not the only guidebooks. It's the philosophers, the literary people, the writers, the shops, the bards, the grammarians, the historians. These are the guidebooks that Redburn really knows and that become the guides for understanding what Redburn's literary experience is. Remember this famous line. When Redburn is going through Liverpool using the guidebook that his father had left for him, he realizes that nothing in the past stands. He says, but I was not born then. No, when my father walked the flagging, I was not so much as thought of. I was not included in the census of the universe. Well, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to find out what Redburn's place was in the universe once he can be counted in the census. We'll come back to it.